His name was Bikkel. Tough nut, die hard, tough Fred Ormskerk. He was 57 years old. A retired warrant officer and adjutant who had served in the colonial wars over in the Dutch East Indies, and he had trained with the Korps Speciale Tropen and spent the final stretch of his career running Dutch conscripts through the jungles of Suriname. Now his son Peter confirmed that it was less of a nickname and more of a diagnosis. I always make a joke to colleagues and friends. Yes, we weren't raised by my father, but we were trained by my father. In the Dutch-trained Surinamese commando culture, Bikkel was a complement of a very specific shape. It meant the first man to go through the door, the one you want on your left in a firefight. Reckless and brave, in the phrase Bouterse himself would reach for a year later when he pinned the nickname on Sergeant Major Wilfred Hawker, the young man that Ormskerk had helped to train, the young man who would die trying to take back what he believed Bouterse had stolen. Both men earned it. Both men died for it. That was the shape of thing that Bouterse had been handed in 1980, a barracks full of Bikkels and only one seat at the top of it. Fred was also a man who had recently given an interview to a Dutch newspaper claiming that the sergeants who pulled off the February coup had executed his plan, the coup that he had been quietly developing throughout 1979, stolen by the boys that he trained. You see, Fred was not a subtle man. He was furious. He liked to drink. He kept secrets from his family. He told everyone else. To the Dutch reporter who had interviewed him in Ermelo that March, Fred had laid out everything. The April 7th Easter date, the 16 soldiers, the 200 trained soldiers that he expected to activate, the floor plans of the Memrebuko barracks which he had possessed, the Dutch nationals that were already positioned in Paramaribo. And then, explaining why he was so confident that it would work, he said the sentence that tells you everything about what kind of man he was and what kind of mission he was about to walk into. And I'll try my best here at the Dutch. Ik heb ze allemaal opgelaten. Ik ken ze allemaal. Voor de jongens, daar ben ik een kot. So, in English, I trained them all, I know them all, for those boys I am a god. He could not stop talking, and that was the problem. In April 1980, he went back to Suriname. Now, to understand why Ormskerk mattered so much to so many parties all at once, you have to remember what the Dutch had just lost. So, Cubans began appearing in Paramaribo on the day of the sergeant's coup itself. American embassy sources have documented it. They were offering assistance before the bodies were even cold. So the Dutch's B-1 intelligence units, their Cold War paranoia was suddenly not just paranoia at all. It was a documented threat that was materializing real time. And the Americans, on the other hand, were applying pressure. Don't push Bouterse toward Cuba. Don't make too many waves. And that pressure landed on the Dutch intelligence apparatus that was about to discover that its own operation in Paramaribo had been compromised from the inside. So the Dutch military mission, the Netherlands' primary institutional intelligence conduit into Suriname, they went native overnight. And Colonel Hans Valk hadn't merely just observed the coup, he had encouraged it, goaded it along. And he was present when Bouterse raised a glass and toasted him without any irony, saying, "Without you, Colonel, this coup would not have taken place." And Valk did not object to that, which means that at the moment the sergeant seized power, the Dutch intelligence in Suriname was compromised down to its root. Every cable that Valk sent off to The Hague was now filtered through their perspective of a man who had chosen what side he was on. So the B1, they began working around Valk. They began looking for options. Exiled officers were being vetted and interviewed. So Roy Botsa and Dick Staphorst and the Vert brothers from Monnikendam. So Delano, the former Dutch state police officer who had served as a conscript under Fred Ormskerk in the early 1970s Treace, and his younger brother Jeff, a former Surinamese armed forces officer. So 3 of these men, Botsa, Staphorst, and Jeff Wirt, they had one thing in common, and it's worth saying clearly. Each of them had spoken to Colonel Valk about a coup before February 25th, 1980, and each of them came away with the same green light phrase. Boys, if you aren't going to do it, the non-commissioned officers will. So Valk would later claim that he was misunderstood, that he only meant the officers needed to put things in order to restore discipline, not to literally seize power. But the men who heard him heard it differently. Wirt, reflecting on the conversation years later, acknowledged the potential dual meaning. Quote, "When he showed us out the door, he didn't literally say take power in the country. I wasn't there to ask for advice. Valk was not the instigator. We had a simple plan." So that's what Valk was doing in the late 1979 and early 1980s. Not giving orders, not issuing taskings, not writing anything down, sitting at the center of a network of frustrated Surinamese officers and providing each of them, one at a time, with the one thing that they needed before they would move: assurance that the Netherlands would not stop them. Botsa heard Valk's phrase in the officers' mess. Staphorst heard it in a similar informal meeting. Jeff Wirt and a colleague heard it when they arrived unannounced to Valk's home in 1980, February, 2 days before the coup, to sound out what kind of reaction the Netherlands would have to a military takeover. So Valk's answer was explicit. The Netherlands would not oppose it. They would just maintain a neutral attitude. So 3 months later, when Fred Ormskerk was arrested in Albina, Jeff Wirt was also arrested in Paramaribo on the same day. So the official charge was involvement in Ormskerk's plot, but Jeff himself believed that he was being tortured, he was being beaten with bull tendons by Horb and Hague for the other coup plan that he had planned. The one that he had already been working on in the early 1980s with the very men who were now beating him. So that is why Bouterse was thanking Valk at the farewell party. Botsa would eventually become a Dutch intelligence asset, and he would be accused by Bouterse of planning the Rambocus coup and 3 subsequent coups and operations. But in the spring of 1980, he was burned as an asset. He was too well known politically. He had been considered a deserter for leaving the revolution. He was too visibly associated with the exile community, so the NCOs wouldn't talk to him. And the Dutch intelligence were essentially blind inside of a country where the Cold War was actively playing out. They needed eyes on the ground. They needed somebody there that the NCOs would actually let back in the country. And there was one more problem. Valk also had approached a man named Michel van Rey, and van Rey was the only commissioned officer in the SKM who actually joined the February 25th coup. So when Colonel Elstack ordered him to fire on the striking sergeants who were protesting and things like that at the barracks, it was Van Rey who tore off the stars of his uniform and he walked over to the NCO side. Then he got on the back of a conscript's moped and he rode to the radio station ABC and broadcast a public call for the Surinamese population to rise up against Aaron government. So within 48 hours, he was a founding member of the NMR. Within 3 weeks, he was the Minister of Army and Police in the new Chinasen government. So the only officer at the table where a country was being handed over. Now, 40 years later, in a 2020 interview with Dutch journalist Ellen de Vries on the pool of a terrace at Hotel Zin in Paramaribo, Van Rey would describe what happened in the months before February 25th. So Bouterse and Minjals visited him late at night around February 20th to walk him through the coup plan. He asked them operational questions like duty rotations, chain of command, who was going to be on watch. He didn't report them to his superiors. So he said in so many words that he was on their side. When asked whether he was the brain behind the coup, he told de Vries he was just a simple question asker. Now, in the same interview describing his pre-coup conversations with Valk, he added one more detail. At some point during those conversations, Edward Luttwak's Coup d'etat, a practical handbook, he was like a CIA adjacent theoretician who wrote textbook on how to do a military takeover. Now, that book appeared on Valk's table, just lying there. Now, Van Rey's words were, you don't really have to name things by name to understand each other, do you? I mean, when the literal coup textbook is sitting there on the table, you can pick up what he's putting down. So that sentence, delivered in 2020 by a former Minister of Army and Police describing the 1979 conversations with the head of the Dutch military mission to Suriname, is the entire operational grammar of what Valk was doing. No orders, no tasking, no written instruction, just a book on how to take over a country with the coup sitting right there on the table during the conversations. And a phrase made in passing. Everybody understands what is being said without anybody needing to formally say anything. So when Valk's recruitment of Botsa, Staphorst, Wirtz failed to produce an officer's coup, or Rambocus for that matter, in 1979, the mission pivoted over to the NCOs. And Van Rey was the one officer who remained on the inside. He would become the Dutch continuous institutional asset across every phase of what came next. You know, the pre-coup officer network, an NMR founding member, civilian government minister, Hague embassy, which is a weird connection. I'm trying to find more information on that, but he's mentioned in the newspapers as being a member of the embassy in The Hague. And eventually, when the network finally decided that Bouterse had to go, Ronnie Brunswick's military second in command. He was part of that insurgency of the Jungle Commando in 1986. But that's getting ahead of the story. So in the spring of 1980, Van Rey was still a cabinet member in Paramaribo, and he was about to do something that would nearly get him killed. Now, a quick note on Rudie Kagie, and I might get that wrong and say Kagie because that's how it's spelled in English, but Rudie Kagie, because he's going to be the central voice of what follows. In May of 1980, Kagie was in Paramaribo. He was a correspondent for the NRC Handelsblad, and he was 29 years old. He was living in a rented house on Gravenstraat, which is in the city center, and he was one of the Dutch journalists who first responded to the word that Fred Ormskerk had been killed at the Memrabuku barracks. So he was also the Dutch journalist that the regime tried hardest to stop from reporting it. He was taken from his home on May 30th, 1980 in the evening, and he was interrogated overnight in the same barracks where Ormskerk had been beaten to death the night before. He was warned personally by Bouterse that people who violate state secrets could end up badly. He was expelled from Suriname within 48 hours. His front door was kicked in by military patrols who arrived an hour after his plane was airborne. So he was the one who called Fred's wife, Sylvie, on her 55th birthday, May 5th, 1980, to ask for confirmation of news the Dutch Foreign Ministry had not yet seen fit to share with her. So Sylvie learned her husband was dead from Kagie's question, not from her own government. He spent the next 32 years trying to return to that story. In 2012, he published Bikkel, the story of the first political murder of the Bouterse regime, the authoritative reconstruction of Fred Ormskerk's final days assembled with the cooperation of the Ormskerk family, including Peter. So when Peter Ormskerk sits on a Paramaribo television panel in 2023 to discuss his father, the book open in front of the interviewers is Kagie's. So this is all to say, when Kagie tells the story, he's not just summarizing things from a distance. He's saying it as a Dutch reporter who was detained for trying to report on the mission in real time, who after that spent decades, 3 decades, in the Dutch archives going through WOB requests, trying to understand, his own government's refusal to let him report on it through secure channels, and who remains the person that the Ormskerk family trusts most to tell what's happened. So this is his story as much as it is Fred's, and bear that in mind as things kind of unfold. A detailed contemporary account of what happens next comes from Ronnie Renz, Sr., writing from the Amigo on May 24th, 1980. So Renz was uniquely positioned to report. Remember, he was the former director of the Suriname State Television, simultaneously serving as the press officer for the American Embassy and political officer Paul Goode's primary source of Suriname's intelligence. So he was a childhood acquaintance of Bouterse who provided, in Goode's later description, invaluable, unfiltered insights into the commander's character that the official diplomatic channels may have missed. So by 1982, as press repression intensified, Renz would flee to Curacao. His May 1980 account is one of the most early and the most detailed public records of the Ormskerk conspiracy's structure. And it comes from somebody who was being briefed and simultaneously briefing the American intelligence apparatus. So according to Renz, Ormskerk's plans were hatched in the Netherlands by at least 4 Surinamese. You had Ormskerk himself, then you had former minister Ewald Karamat Ali, then you had Paul Sumardo, and then you had Roy Botsa. Karamat Ali was a government advisor and a lawyer under the previous Aaron government. So he had escaped post-coup roundup, and he had resurfaced back in the Netherlands. Now, Ali was not a sympathetic figure. According to reporting from that period, together with Dr. Frank Essed, he sat on the Netherlands-Suriname Development Cooperation Commission, which was called CONS, ironically, which is tasked with assessing how development funds could be spent. So they had their finger in every pie. Through supervisory board positions at companies and agencies, they had a financial interest in the development projects or as advisors to enterprises and ministries. So Essed, for example, was on the payroll of Brunzil and Billiton, while Karamat Ali was on that of the multinational Reynolds. So both received substantial salaries from the Ministry of Development. His advisory income of approximately 120,000 Surinamese guilders a year had been cited by the Civil Service Union as a symbol of the elites and their corruption, right? So this forced Prime Minister Aron to defend him in a parliamentary inquiry in February of 1979. So his brother, Ahmed, was not so lucky. The former Minister of Public Works and Transportation was captured as a part of the roundup of former officials that were considered corrupt that was done in February 1980, and he became the first former Aaron minister put on trial by the new regime. So on January 30th, 1981, Bouterse's corruption tribunal sentenced him to 2.5 years. So historians later would note that this was kind of strange because of the nature of that sentence. It was higher than was expected. And partially, they think it was because the regime was using Ahmed to punish Ewald. So they couldn't reach the brother that they wanted, so they doubled down on the punishment for the one that they had. So one brother tried in the other brother's place. And that was the same regime that Ewald was now conspiring against in Ormskerk's house back in Ermelo. So Like every member of the Aran government, he was now a former minister by virtue of the February 25th coup. So on the other side of the Ormskerk affair stood Johan Kasantaroeno. So he was the former Minister of Agriculture and Fisheries, and he had been the only member of the Aran cabinet who wasn't present in Paramaribo when the coup happened. He had managed to escape Papillon style via Saint-Laurent in French Guiana, and in that border town, he claimed he was being shadowed by a commando troop tasked with liquidating him, which is interesting because the only commandos at the time were Gore. Hawker wouldn't even go through commando training until 1980, so I don't know how much truth there is to that, but maybe he just meant soldiers. From there, despite having no papers, he reached the Netherlands by way of the United States with French assistance. So his request for political asylum in The Hague was countered with an offer of naturalization instead, and they gave him an expedited process. So he later resurfaced in Lisse with his family. So the Ormskerk's familiarity with the Surinamese military structure was really up close and personal. In March of 1975, 8 months before Surinamese independence, he was still serving as a sergeant major in Trieste. There's a photograph I'll show you here at a rank ceremony alongside Colonel Martin Voorli. Now, he was the senior Trieste officer who, in 1974 and 75, it was his command that included planning that would eventually produce Operation Black Tulip. So whether or not Ormskerk was ever briefed on that Black Tulip planning, there's no document that shows that. But what is documented by this picture is that he was present, he was uniformed, and he was active in Voorli's command structure during that exact months that the Black Tulip plans were taking shape. So according to Peter Ormskerk, his father was sent to Suriname by the Exile network on a secret reconnaissance mission, not necessarily to lead an invasion, but to assess whether the military could be persuaded to be pressured back into the barracks and to deliver letters to former politicians still in Paramaribo. We'll talk about what was in it. But that was all, as Rudie Kagie put it. So in Peter's telling of the story, his father's self-understanding of the mission was even more specific. Fred Ormskerk believed, and he said this openly, that the soldiers do not belong in the politics. They belong in the barracks. And that he was the only one who could get the boys back into the barracks because he had trained them. Now, 2 of Fred's letters were actually intercepted. The first one was written by Erwald Karamat Ali, and it was written to a supporter in Paramaribo. This was quoted by Ronnie Renz in the May 24th Amigo article. Here's what it said. "This is not cowboy theater. Phase 1 is already in effect." The second letter was written by Johan Kasantaroeno from his residence in Lisse to Dr. Kuno Koldfried in Paramaribo. So it was intercepted not because the Dutch or the Surinamese intelligence was tracking Kasantaroeno, they weren't, but because the letter's recipient, Kasantaroeno, was already in the Memrabuku barracks custody on an unrelated corruption charge when the letter arrived at his house. Rudie Kagie produces the letter in full in his book, and it's worth reading all of it. It went like this. "I'll write in telegram style for lack of time. The bearer of this letter," which would have been Fred Ormskerk, "is to be trusted. Phase 1 is underway. Goal, takeover of power and restoration of the Constitution. Military leader is a very well-known military man. Has earned his stripes. Personnel in place. Crossing is a problem. Weapons already in Suriname. Whatever else you hear from that man, I stand behind him. You know me. I work thoroughly. I don't trust a single night of ice." Now, that last part takes a little bit of translation for English. Pretty much what they're implying is, when a pond freezes, you don't walk on a single night's layer of ice. He's saying the same thing here. So that's 2 men, 2 letters, same month, 2 different recipients, 2 different Dutch return address, both using the same framework, phase 1 implying a phase 2. One of them, the Kasantaroeno letter, laying out the operational kind of inventory, military leader, track record, personnel in place, weapons already positioned in Suriname. Only the crossing piece they hadn't resolved quite yet. This was not cowboy theater. The operation was, though, underfunded from the very beginning. And this had plagued Surinamese resistance for years. Lack of money and resources. So the court documents established that the network had no money to cover the crossing expenses, and they were passing cash, probably petty traveling money, to Ormskerk through supporters. But it had the right basic architecture, political principles in exile, a preliminary plan, and a date. The same network, largely intact, would assist in the planning of the Rambocus coup in March of 1982. At least 3 subsequent coup operations after that as well. So Ormskerk's death interrupted phase 1, and it did not destroy, though, what was being built. Rambocus would show that. Now let's put on our Gladio glasses for a second. Viewed plainly, this is just the story of a retired soldier who returned to a volatile country and was killed by an insecure regime. Ormskerk was reckless, he talked too much, he picked the wrong destination and the wrong mission in the wrong moment. But if you put on your Gladio glasses, what changes? Ormskerk stops being just a mere reckless person and starts looking like the most logical asset available to anybody who needed eyes on the ground in Suriname in the spring of 1980. As a Dutch citizen holding the gold medal of the Orange Order of Nassau, he would have passed Reinder's loyalty test with flying colors. In the barracks culture Bouterse had built, hierarchical, insular, suspicious of others and outsiders, only a handful of men could have plausibly walked back in and been heard. Fred believed he was one of those men. He had trained them personally. He was deniable. He was operating under the political cover of a private exile network, no official fingerprints required. And before retiring to the Netherlands, Ormskerk had had a drinking session at a local pub with Johan Cornelius Krol, a Dutch handyman who was living in Suriname. Now, during this session, Ormskerk told Krol that he might need to return to Suriname to take power in a coup. Krol agreed to help him, and Ormskerk gave him several sticks of dynamite to hold on to for when he came back, which is a classic Gladio maneuver. You remember us talking about that in episode 7, where one of the things they would do was they would bury caches of weapons or leave them behind on farms or in the woods and things like that. So him leaving behind dynamite for a coup with a friend that he discussed it with in 1979 looks a lot like a Gladio-style operation. It was the kind of pre-positioning that matched exactly what Kasantaroeno's letter described. Weapons already in Suriname. So if Fred succeeded, the Hague could look away. If he failed, he would be disowned. The problems with his new mission were obvious looking back, and they should have been more obvious in foresight. So he could not keep his mouth shut. He liked to drink. He was furious with the sergeants who had executed his plan, and that grievance was going to show. And it did. It showed on terraces in Saint-Laurent. It showed in coffee houses in Paramaribo. So these Gladio connections are inferences. They're not established fact. No document has ever been shown yet that shows a formal B1 tasking order sending Ormskerk down to Paramaribo. What the documentary record does show is shows a man with the right profile deployed through the exile network being actively monitored by Dutch intelligence. They actually have a B1 file on Ormskerk, so they were watching him. And he was being sent into a situation where the Dutch intelligence desperately needed somebody to get information that he was going to gather. So whether somebody kind of nudged him along or whether he simply walked in that direction on his own, in a way that suited multiple parties simultaneously, that might never be fully resolved. But what is not inference was that he was sent on a secret mission, and he talked about it on the public terraces. And the boys that he had trained killed him for it. Now, Peter Ormskerk was asked in 2022 whether his father was capable of a coup, and his answer was careful. Fred would not have done it alone, but someone could have moved him to do it. The Surinamese politicians who fled to the Netherlands, the Exile network who wanted the regime gone, they wanted the soldiers back in the barracks for the things to return to normal, and they knew how to reach his father. Quote, they played on his ego. You're the only one. And he felt very proud. So that's not proof of a Dutch intelligence order. It's something a lot simpler. It's how you take a proud man who's trained the soldiers who had just taken over the country. You tell him he's the only one who can fix it. He believes you, and he goes. The mission began back in the Netherlands from Fred's home in Ermelo. He had established contact with the Exile network, your Karamat Alis, your Bouterse, the NPK remnants, the two Vert brothers who were there. They were all coordinating on what they were calling Phase 1. Fred told his family that he was going on vacation in France, but he went to French Guiana instead. Another half-truth. So in Saint-Laurent du Maroni, on the public terrace of a guest house a short distance from the Surinamese border, he talked. According to Ronnie Renz, he spoke on the public terrace of a guest house about the coup. Verheij and Van Westerlo state that the witness later recalled how he, Fred, after a drink, spoke openly of plans and possibilities. He spoke loudly. He spoke confidentially. And this was a pattern with Fred. He could not stop performing a mission he was supposed to be conducting in secret. So whether the whole alert reached Bouterse's Secret Service from the conversations that Fred was having in Saint-Laurent, or whether they happened from a later conversations that he was having on the Orlando's terrace, where he was drinking glasses of Joko rice beer and telling the tables, speaking loudly to anybody around him that he would listen, that he was going to lift the men from the saddle, meaning the NCOs. That part we haven't fully established, like which of those was the straw that broke the camel's back. Either way, the alert had reached the barracks by afternoon, Wednesday, April 30th, 1980. Fred was arrested later that evening in Albina by a regiment commander, Henk Siegfried van Randwijk. He had bragged loud enough to the whole room at Orlando's that he would return to French Guiana via the border crossing at Albina. A soldier in plain clothes that was sitting 2 tables away had overheard him say this, and van Randwijk was waiting for him when he arrived. So as Fred was loaded into the military jeep, something strange happened. He saw an old friend walking past, and he pointed. He said, he's one of them too, Fred said. So the man that he pointed at was Johan Krol, the Dutch handyman who had been drinking with him at Orlando's coffee shop 4 years earlier. The man who he had trusted with all the sticks of dynamite to carry with him at the farm before Fred went back to the Netherlands in 1979. Well, that man just happened to be walking past a stationary military jeep on Paramaribo Street, minding his own business, allegedly, and Krol was arrested on the spot because Fred named names. So Fred did not leave the Memro-Buku barracks alive. Krol did not leave Suriname's custody fully functional. By the time the regime put Krol in front of the cameras to confess to this mercenary invasion, Horb had castrated him. Then there's the story of Virginia Hoffman. Now, she was a nurse from Albina who had helped Roy Botza in his escape from the February coup. So she was brought before the military council for questioning shortly after Ormskerk's arrest, and she described what she saw. Quote, a thick, swollen face, arm broken, I think, and blood everywhere. Blood on the walls, blood against the desk. Sital and Minjals, who at the time were in the military council, asked the questions. And meanwhile, Bagwandas and Rosendahl beat him. I had to tell where I had all brought him. I had to confess more than I could confess. And because I could confess no more, I was thrown on Ormskerk, dragged through his blood. Her guard left the door open. Reason? That way I can enjoy along, he told her. That guard was John Harjoparino. He would later become the Minister of Culture. In 2012, he told journalist Rudie Kagie that he had been at a birthday party in Billiton that night and he didn't remember seeing Ormskerk. Now, Paul Bogwandas, who had administered most of the blows that killed Fred Ormskerk in the Paramaribo barracks in May of 1980, he was named as the organizer of the executions at Fort Zeelandia in December of 1982. So the whole methodology had been rehearsed on Fred's body in 1980, and it would be deployed at a much bigger scale 31 months later. So Ruben Rosendahl, then a member of Bouterse's inner circle, later a witness in the December murder trials, he was also present, and he described what he had seen. Quote, "They beat him just as long with sticks until a confession would come, but nothing came. He was a tough military man. They knew from the start he wouldn't say anything. I read in his eyes that he was innocent. Who gave the order? That was Mr. Bouterse." In the night of May 1st to May 2nd, Frederick Ferdinand Ormskerk died. The Dutch autopsy by Dr. Zeldenroost documented what had been done to him. 4 fractured ribs on the right anterior side, 2 on the left posterior side, extensive hemorrhaging throughout the soft tissues, cerebral edema, death due to shock as a consequence of the injuries sustained. The brain had been removed during the Surinamese autopsy and replaced with formalin-soaked cloths. The regime's official story shifted 4 times. First, they said he was shot at Abina in a border fight. Secondly, they said he was shot while escaping. Later, Bouterse Sital on May 6th claimed that he died after resisting a guard during a confessional attempt. And finally, there was Jan de Koning's version on May 12th that said that he was found lifeless in a cell, no violence. The body told a different story each time. The NMR's press conference narrative was even more ambitious. They claimed a 300-person mercenary invasion force, Belgians, Venezuelans, South Moluccans, foreign government sponsors, a liquidation list, weapons produced for the cameras were, as multiple journalists who saw them recognized, they were Surinamese army stock, which the implication is that they had brought out their own weapons and laid them down and pretended that they were Fred's weapons. So no documented military force was ever produced. The regime's narrative, however, had served its purpose. The military ends up sidelining the civilian authority, and it heightens the crackdowns on internal security and curfews and more police on the streets, and it justifies further arrests. So a reconnaissance mission by one boastful retired soldier became justification for consolidating even more power. But here's the problem with exaggeration. The story was built on a kernel of truth. Karamat Ali's letters referenced a phase 1 and implied a phase 2. Botsa was in Utrecht. Sumarho was in the Netherlands. The network the NMR presented as an active 300-man invasion force, it was kind of real, but it was in its embryonic stage, right? There were neo-fascists like the Front de la Jeunesse, the FJ, who had been running covert training camps in the Ardennes, and they were planning state destabilizations, and they'd been doing that since 1975. And they had left to form the Westland New Post between 1979 and 1980, during this period that we're talking about. So that same group of people, the same networks, they were recruited by Ido Joman and Peter van Hopperen 2 years later. So they just weren't linked yet to this kind of Suriname operation, but they were probable that they did exist. So, but the NMR took the plans that were written down on paper and they presented it as if it were a factual coup, just how others would present Black Tulip as if it was a factual coup. So the coverage that they invented was like a carnival mirror, a distortion of something that was genuinely being organized. And we need to pay attention to how that works, because Bouterse would use this exact formula for the rest of his life. His playbook was pretty simple. You start with something real. Karamat Ali's letter, Kasantaroeno's letters, they were all real, the network, the planning, all of that stuff, right? Kagie confirms that there was actually an elimination list too among the documents that were captured by the authorities. So you keep those pieces, the true pieces, and you make them visible. Let the journalists document it, let it get on the news, let sympathetic politicians repeat them, and then you build the rest of your story that you want on top of that truthful foundation. So Kagie explicitly concludes that the mercenary army piece and the alleged weapons arsenal, that existed only in the fantasy of the military who were responsible for Fred Ormskerk's death. But by the time that anyone was in a position to ask the real tough questions, the real pieces had already done their work, and that made the whole story feel like it was true. And the test case for all of this happened with Bram Peper. Now, in May of 1980, Bram Peper was the second vice chairman of the PVDA, the Dutch Labour Party. And he had just returned from a 10-day-long trip down to Suriname, where he had sat with 4 of the NMR leaders until deep in the night. So he was not naive. He also wasn't hostile to the regime. There's a March 7th NRC Handelsblad piece where he is arguing that engaging with the new government was not neo-colonialism, but it was actually just good policy. But he also wasn't a propagandist either. He came back from Paramaribo and told the Dutch press that the Ormskerk operation was, in his words, a deadly serious matter. He described the rifles and the sticks of TNT found on the farm near Kvattenvik. 60 people targeted for summary execution, he said on the list. A Dutch former legionnaire who had shot a policeman in the Netherlands and escaped to the Foreign Legion. South Moluccans and Belgian mercenaries recruited from the cafe in Brussels, the same location that was later reported by Johan, by the way. So some of it was true and some of it wasn't. Krol, for example, was not true. He was not a legionnaire. He had been rejected from military service because he had tuberculosis. The weapons produced for the camera, those we've already established, were Surinamese stock. But what Peper described in clinical detail with the authority of a senior politician who had just spent 10 days inside the country and been briefed by its leadership was the NMR's cover story for the murder that they had just committed 4 days before his arrival. So he was telling the truth, at least the truth that he had been told. So that's the method. You don't need everyone to believe the full picture. You just need them to repeat the version that you've given them. So Peper flew home. He repeated it in the Dutch press. The parliament cited his accounts. The foreign ministry read his 34-page travel document report. And the fiction moved through the legitimate channels because it had been delivered by a legitimate witness. So this theme, the telling of the partial truth and its repercussions, it dominates this entire Suriname Contra series. You have Valk's reports to the Netherlands being ignored by Vegelin because they were allegedly exaggerated. You've got Bouterse's regime, who began inflating the truth as soon as they murdered their former trainee, and they would do it again a couple months later after killing Hawker. So by the time December 1982 rolls around, when another coup is being planned, this time with actual foreign powers involved, Bouterse had been practicing this formula ever since Fred Ormskerk's death in May of 1980. And the lie he would tell wouldn't be to cover up one murder in the December murders, it would be to cover up 15 of them. Now, let's get back to the NMR's press conference where they tried to explain why a Dutch citizen was tortured to death on Surinamese soil. But before we get to what Chinna Sen chose to do in that press conference, there's one more thing you need to understand about the press conference that launched this entire system. So Joop Krol, he didn't just walk out in front of those cameras willingly. He was dragged out. He was produced and propped up for this event. So according to Andre Hoffman, who was speaking publicly in 1983 after he fled the country when they tried to assassinate him too, Krol had been castrated before he was brought out before the press. His wife, Lencha, her letter to Amnesty International, written on June 22nd of 1980, less than 8 weeks after his arrest, describes what he told her when she was finally permitted to see him. He was 3 days naked in a cell without food or water. He had a torn liver, damaged kidneys, damaged bladder, damaged gallbladder, blindness in his left eye, a broken tailbone, and, in his words, the gentleman of the NMR cut into my genitals. Krol was then patched up at the military hospital. They tried to kill him there, his wife wrote. Only an intervention by another soldier prevented it. The Dutch journalist Rob Herkels, writing in the De Volkskrant, open forum in January 1981, while Krol was still alive in Surinamese custody, he named the specific perpetrator, Garrison Commander Roy Horb. What stood in front of those cameras and confessed to a mercenary invasion was a man who had been systematically destroyed. The press conference was not a fabrication performed by a willing actor. It was a production that was staged on a broken human being. And file that away too, because that's also not an aberration. It's not just excess, things got out of hand. This becomes policy. As the first documented incidents, as the methodology the regime would later refine and deploy again and again. Take a real threat, inflate it beyond recognition, and put out a ruined body in front of the cameras to prove that it was true. So the torture was not incidental to the lie. The torture was what made the lie believable. So Verhey and Van Westerlo, who reconstructed this whole affair 3 years later, they identified two key moments when Suriname's history might have gone wildly differently. The first was May 6th of 1980, when Prime Minister Henk Chinesen was handed a television script describing Ormskerk as a coup plotter who was killed while resisting. Now, the script had been written by Henk Herenberg, the NMR's daily advisor who was a regular presence in the Paramaribo barracks. The original script credited the National Army and the National Military Council in cooperation with the people for foiling the supposed coup. Chinesen was being asked to read a televised statement that erased his own constitutional role. He knew at least part of it was a lie, because the script said that Ormskerk had been killed while resisting, and Chinesen knew better. He was a doctor, and 2 days earlier, on the morning of May 3rd, he had personally intervened with Ambassador Vegelin to stop Ormskerk's burial and to order a pathological investigation, precisely because the whole circumstances around Ormskerk's death did not match what the regime was saying. So the autopsy would eventually confirm what everybody already had suspected. Ormskerk had been beaten to death, not killed in some kind of a firefight. So whether Chinesen actually knew by May 6th how much of the broader story, the mercenary invasion force, the coup, plotting with foreign backing, the liquidation list, how much of it was fabricated and how much of it was real, that part is less certain. That fabrication would reach its full bloom at the NMR's press conference 6 days later. But the core lie of how Ormskerk died was already visible to him when he sat down and read the script. He opened the broadcast with the declaration that he was a great supporter of openness. He toned the accusations down. He replaced the NMR's triumphal language about armed conspiracy and with a little more cautious attempts by a few irresponsible elements. He named no one. He still delivered the lie, just in a softer register. His advisor, Andre Hoffman, urged him to resign and flee the country. Hoffman already had an escape route planned, a weekend trip for Chinesen to a holiday cottage near Albina, cross over into French Guiana. There would be a safe house waiting for him in Drenthe. Chinesen walked through the night, and in the morning he said, "I'm staying." The second one. Sen obtained the actual autopsy, reportedly through a friendly medical contact. He read it. It describes cerebral edema from blunt force. Ormskerk had been murdered. Hackmat said to resign. Sen stayed. Hackmat's verdict? With Ormskerk, the revolution derailed. He meant the Surinamese revolution, but there's a second reading. The Dutch-Surinamese relationship derailed with Ormskerk as well. The moment the Netherlands chose to cover up over accountability for his death, it locked itself into this posture that it would never escape from. Quote, the direct Dutch involvement in the coup made the Netherlands vulnerable to blackmail. According to the Vrij Nederland article, Bouterse only had to threaten to reveal details about the coup to force all sorts of painful matters to be ignored. Now, as for Sen's lies, it's easy to judge looking backwards, but it's worth remembering that while he was there delivering that speech, he was being watched by men who had just proven what they were capable of. And the former Prime Minister, Henk Aaron, was imprisoned by the military regime on charges of corruption. Verhey and Van Westerlo identified two moments, but there was actually a third. 25 days after Ormskerk died at the Paramaribo barracks, Michel van Rey, the Minister of Army and Police, who had helped deliver Sen's government 3 weeks earlier, he walked into a cabinet room and he said what Sen had refused to say on television. His exact words, which are preserved in Rudie Kagie's later constructions, are these. Desi, if we don't thoroughly crush these kind of excesses, it will work against us. Now, he didn't stop there. Van Rey demanded that the NMR be dissolved so his civilian ministry could exercise judicial control over the army. He demanded that the NMR members surrender their privilege, their private chauffeurs, their commandeered houses, the whole parallel apparatus of a shadow government running inside of the civilian one, right? And he drafted a formal ministerial memorandum laying out the entire consolidation program and sent it through Ambassador Vegelin to The Hague. Now, the memorandum became the basis for 3 diplomatic cables that were transmitted from April 16th to April 22nd. They're still sitting in the Dutch National Archive under inventory number 25388. So, at the time, he was the sitting Minister of Army and Police under the Republic of Suriname, and he was saying that the Ormskerk cover-up would destroy the regime. He was putting it in writing. And on May 27th, 1980, 25 days after Ormskerk was killed, Sital and Minjals drove an armored vehicle to the government center and they demanded that Van Rey's arrest for high treason. So it was their intent to take him to the Paramaribo barracks and where he would stand trial in front of the same men who had beaten Fred Ormskerk to death in that same garrison 3 weeks earlier. So Sen and Hackmat understood exactly what that meant. There would be no trial. There would be another body. So what happened next is documented in Hackmat's own 1987 memoir. Sen and Hackmat orchestrated a plan with Dutch Ambassador Vegelin to hide Van Rey at the Dutch embassy under the cover of a Dutch military meeting mission, while armored vehicles and jeeps scoured Paramaribo looking for him. Now, Van Rey was sheltered in the ambassador's official residence, The Hague, the same The Hague that had 3 weeks earlier denied Rudie Kagie's use of diplomatic code services on the grounds of precedent, formally denied Van Rey's asylum request, but allowed the sheltering to keep continuing while the whole negotiations were happening behind the scenes. So Bouterse took the moderate position, and he kind of had to. I mean, Sital and Minjals had just tried to kill a sitting civilian minister with an armored vehicle for saying out loud what Sen had refused to say on television. So Bouterse negotiated Van Rey's safe passage on the condition that he resign immediately, leave the country. So early next morning on May 28th, Van Rey, his wife, and their children were loaded into a 3-car convoy. Chinesen rode with them, Hoffman rode with them, the Dutch Ambassador Vegelin rode with them, and they drove straight to Zaandam Airport. So Van Rey signed his resignation on the tarmac, then he got the next flight out. And he went specifically to New York, where Ambassador Vegelin had been allegedly stranded on February 25th, 1980, when the Sergeant's Coup happened, and which had served as the UN and CIA's operational hub for the Caribbean throughout the relevant period of the early 80s. So he didn't go to Amsterdam. He was the first Surinamese cabinet minister forced out by the military, and he would not be the last. So just watch what happens. 3 weeks before Van Rey's near execution, the Dutch embassy deputy head, Singa Dameste, arranged for Rudie Kagie's Saturday night escape through French Guiana. But Kagie's boss at NRC Handelsblad was told that The Hague had refused to use the diplomatic code service to transmit reporting on the grounds of precedent. Now, 3 weeks later, the same Dutch embassy sheltered a Surinamese cabinet minister in the ambassador's official residence and coordinated a 3-car extraction convoy to Zaandam Airport and put him on a plane to New York with the prime minister and the senior policy advisor riding along in the car. So when a Dutch journalist was in danger of being killed for reporting on the Ormskerk cover-up, the state moved with bureaucratic caution. I don't know. But when a Surinamese minister was in danger of being killed for trying to correct the Ormskerk cover-up, the Dutch state moved decisively. So the difference really wasn't the urgency factor, it was the difference of who the Dutch state thought it was accountable to. And notice the political dynamic Bouterse just inherited. Sital and Minjals had overreached right in front of the Dutch ambassador and in front of the prime minister, in front of a cabinet minister's wife and children. Bouterse had positioned himself as the moderate. He was still thought of as a right-winger at the time, who saved Van Rey's life against his own radical NMR colleagues. 3 months later, when the time was right, he would use the same positioning to arrest the men who had overreached, Sital, Minjals, and Johan. The Ormskerk playbook wasn't just working against Dutch citizens anymore. It was beginning to work inside the regime itself, turning Bouterse's most radical allies into targets for his next move. There were actually 3 moments, not 2. The first was Chinesen. He read the script that he knew was a lie. The second, he read the autopsy that proved it was a lie and he stayed around anyway. And the third was Van Rey had tried to correct the cover-up and the Dutch state moved to save him decisively, efficiently, and with resources that were nowhere to be found 3 weeks earlier when the journalists needed them. So that response tells you everything. Lieutenant Piet van Dijk of the Dutch military mission, he was present at the first burial of Ormskerk on May 3rd. He was present at the autopsy. The report came to him through regular channels because in the institutional vacuum that was left because of the Sergeant's Coup, he was the de facto head of the military police as well. So he was simultaneously an employee of the Dutch Crown and an operational figure with the institution that had just beaten a Dutch citizen to death. So Van Dijk brought the findings to a mission meeting. Colonel Valk was still there at the time, and all the mission members learned about the contents of what happened during the interrogation. The report reached Ambassador Vegelin's desk through the mission channels in late May. So the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs had the document by mid-May at the latest. Now, what forced the document's eventual return was Adjutant Nico Lora. So you may remember him. He's a fellow mission member. He was the man who had drunkenly admitted that Clements was involved in planning the Bouterse coup. And here he goes again. He leaks again, already informing the Surinamese military leadership that Van Dijk was in possession of the document. So Bouterse threatened to shoot him in the head. and Van Dyck put it back without making a copy. Then for nearly 7 months, Ambassador Vegelin officially and repeatedly asked the Surinamese government to provide the autopsy report, formally, through diplomatic channels, for a document that he already had on his desk. So the Dutch journalist Rob Herkels laid out the whole sequence publicly in a 1981 Volkskrant piece. Quote, "It took nearly 7 months before the Netherlands officially protested the beating to death of the Dutchman Ormskerk. 7 months of bureaucratic choreography around the autopsy report the foreign ministry had held since mid-May, and Herkels noted that one more thing that the official protest didn't cover. Quote, there was no mention whatsoever of the treatment of another Dutchman, Krol, who was castrated by garrison commander Horb during an interrogation." That's Roy Horb, named in print in a mainstream Dutch newspaper in January of 1981, not as a rumor, not as an allegation from an exile years later, but as a reported fact, published while Krol was still alive in a Surinamese prison. And the Dutch state, which was at that exact moment extending the military mission treaty for another year, they treated it as it had treated everything else, as something that could be filed away. In Herkel's phrase, Suriname seeks after its own path after the colonial period. An anonymous official at the Foreign Ministry's Political Affairs Department scrawled something in the margins. Handle this cautiously to avoid deterring the Surinamese authorities and guarantee the privacy of the family. The public prosecutor in Zwolle was blunter. Let me put it plainly. In this case, the international political interest was greater than the individual interest of one Dutchman. So what Dutch policy looked like from inside of Suriname in those first days is worth pausing on, because as noted earlier, one Dutch citizen who went to Paramaribo to report on Ormskerk's death was nearly killed for it. And the embassy that saved him declined to use its own secure channels to protect his reporting. So Seneke Damste, the ambassador counselor who arranged for Rudie Kagie's Saturday night escape to Cayenne, had proposed sending Kagie's article to NRC Handelbad via the embassy's diplomatic code service. So it was a secure channel that would have protected the transmission from Surinamese surveillance. The Hague declined. They stated the reason was precedent. The Dutch ambassador was treating the whole situation as an emergency. The Hague was treating it as a question of diplomatic precedence. So both responses were technically correct in their own terms. The whole gap between those is where the Fred Ormskerk story disappeared. And Rudie Kagie spent years understanding why. His WOB request unearthed the Council of Ministers minutes. What they showed was, quote, the Netherlands was under pressure from the United States. They said, be careful with Suriname. Don't criticize them too much, because if you push them too hard, they will drive into the arms of Cuba and become a socialist country. That is the boring reason. So his thesis, Dutch Suriname policy at that moment, was not made in The Hague, but in Washington. If you add a little analytical layer draped over the top of that, it becomes clear. Each institution withstanding to act on behalf of the Ormskerk family had its own separate reasons not to. The Americans had their own Cold War calculations. The Dutch Foreign Ministry were trying to preserve the China-Sen relationship. The Dutch military, they had Valk's whole problem and exposure. And then you had the potential intelligence connection that nobody wants to explain why their asset was down in the country in the first place. So you got four reasons kind of stacked on top of each other. Together, they made the cover-up not just politically convenient, but kind of inevitable from an institutional point of view. So what does it all mean? The man who died, Fred Ormskerk, was not your typical heroic figure. He was a complicated figure. He was lonely, he was boastful, maybe he didn't know what to do with retirement, and he was incapable of keeping a secret on a mission that required him to keep things secret. He was sent by a network that couldn't cover the basic crossing cost expenses. He trained the young men who beat him to death. He had told a Dutch reporter 6 weeks before it happened that to these boys, he was a god. Verhey and von Westerlo closed their reconstruction with a list that reads like a formal indictment. Quote, a man was arrested, he was interrogated, he was beaten, he died, he was buried, he was exhumed, he was dissected, reports were written, reports were classified, reports were transmitted, reports were withheld, questions were asked, answers were delayed, answers were incomplete. Thus, also in the Netherlands, the truth concerning Ormskerk's death sank into a swamp of political and military interests. Officially, the Netherlands no longer needed to know about the cause of Ormskerk's death. Not a firefight, not a coup, a swamp. And the swamp had many architects. 28 months later, on December 8th, 1982, 15 prominent Surinamese citizens were taken from their beds and shot in Fort Zeelandia. The regime had learned the lessons Ormskerk's death had taught. Murder without consequences is the new policy. The same scenario, the same logic, the same institutional silence, scaled up by a factor of 15. Ormskerk's death wasn't just a failed coup, it was the opening of a pattern. In two decisive moments, when a civilian prime minister chose to read the script he knew was a lie, and when the Dutch government chose to ask politely for a report already on its desk, nobody marked it as what it was. The first page of a chapter that was going to end very badly, including 3 years later, for one Dutch official who tried to break the silence and tell Fred's widow what really had happened. Officially, the Netherlands chose not to know how Fred Ormskerk died. The autopsy report went back to Bouterse without a copy. The foreign ministry's marginal notes, to avoid deterring Surinamese authorities, expressed the institutional consensus. The public prosecutor in Zwolle said the quiet part out loud. The international political interest was greater than the individual interest of a single Dutchman. The file was closed. Unofficially, something else was going on. In 1980, to his own sworn account, Peter van Happeren received a tasking order from his handlers, Kurt Goerlitz and Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm Kukler, both who he identifies as his superiors in what he calls the Dienst, which was a parallel intelligence structure operating under Interdoc's umbrella. So his assignment was very specific. In the aftermath of the Ormskerk failed counter coup, and subsequent murder, his job was to assess whether a coup in Suriname was feasible. Not to plan one yet, not to execute one, but look at the board and report back. They needed another insider in the country now that Fred was gone. Quote, after the failed coup of and the murder of Ormskerk, Van Happen received the assignment to investigate whether a coup in Suriname would be possible. So his own written testimony to the same judge fills in the logic of the operation. Quote, the fear existed among my bosses that the Bouterse regime was moving more and more to the left and that the situation in Suriname was deteriorating. So the official channels had just demonstrated with clinical precision that they would not act. The parallel track was the answer to that demonstration. It was, at that stage in time, strictly exploratory, like Ormskerk's had been largely exploratory. Van Happeren explains it plainly. Broad strokes only. Which people, what an invasion team would look like, via which routes Suriname could be entered, whether the neighboring countries, specifically French Guiana, Brazil, might provide support. No assault weapons yet, no order, no date. Now that all changed in May of 1981. The signs had been accumulating for months. On February 28th, Minister of Foreign Affairs Harvey Narendorp announced from Paramaribo that Suriname and Cuba would exchange ambassadors at a full diplomatic level. The relationship that had existed on paper since 1979 was now being operationalized. A week later, Bouterse released Sital, Minjals, and Johan from prison and told a press conference in Suriname that they would follow the course of socialism. Minjals, fresh out of the dungeon, went straight to the microphones and told the reporters that given the developments surrounding Cuba and Nicaragua, one would be naive not to expect agitation against us. Any Dutch cabinet minister with a newspaper subscription had the trajectory in front of him by mid-March. De Dienst was 2 months behind the Volkskrant. But it was the Havana visit itself that flipped the switch inside the parallel intelligence network. When Bouterse and Narendorp traveled to meet Fidel Castro in May of 1981, the visit registered inside De Dienst as a threshold crossing event. Suriname was not just drifting left, it was choosing left. Van Haperen was told to become more active, to move from reconnaissance to preparation, so that if the situation in Suriname reached the point of requiring intervention, the infrastructure would be ready. Simultaneously, Karl Armfeldt, the CIA operative conducting the whole parallel networks in the Netherlands and Belgium, received what Van Haperen describes as an American tasking to take the Suriname operations seriously. Reagan had taken office in January. The DIA and the NSC, where Oliver North was operating, joined into the planning architecture. By the summer of 1981, the Reagan administration and the CIA, under the leadership of Director William Casey, who was North's mentor, viewed Suriname as a potential Soviet or Cuban foothold in South America. Casey proposed a covert action plan aimed at destabilizing and bringing about regime change in both Suriname and the leftist government of Grenada. However, when the CIA presented these early paramilitary plans on the Senate Select Committee of Intelligence in July of 1981, they met immediate and fierce legislative resistance. The committee forcefully opposed the initiative and dissuaded the CIA from launching the covert operation. The congressional opposition was reportedly driven by, quote, unusual and unspecified components, unquote, within the CIA's proposal. The presentation was met with outright disbelief by some of the members of the Oversight Committee. Senator Lloyd Bentsen, a Democrat from Texas, reportedly reacted to the CIA's briefing by stating, quote, "You've got to be kidding." The proposed covert action against Suriname and Grenada was viewed as so extreme that another famous senator described the plan as being so, quote, off the wall, quote, that it had to be completely dropped. So you notice the timeline. Koenders is building his criminal case against Valk through the summer of 1981, documenting the coup's Dutch origins, working toward the December 7th report that Schulte would bury. Van Haperen is simultaneously beginning operational preparation for a counter-coup. Both men are moving through the same institutional world, the Dutch military, the intelligence apparatus, the Suriname desk, without, as far as the records show, any awareness of each other yet. The investigator documenting what went wrong, the operator preparing for the next move. Two tracks, one direction, neither, at least above the covers, knew where the other one was going. But before any of that, before Koenders started investigating, before Van Haperen started preparing, something else had to happen first. Bouterse had won in May of 1980. The Ormskerk playbook worked. A Dutch citizen had been tortured to death on Surinamese soil, and the Dutch state had decided not to know. The civilian prime minister had read the script. The autopsy had gone back to Bouterse without a copy. The marginal notes on the Kamervraken response had said to handle it all cautiously. It worked so well that Bouterse tried to run the same playbook against his own men. Within 10 months, he would turn on 3 members of the National Military Council who sat beside him at the May 12th press conference. Bouterse Sital, Chas Minjals, Stanley Johan. So these men who had interrogated Virginia Hoffman, the men who had stood at the microphones and described a mercenary invasion that didn't fully exist, Bouterse would arrest them in August of 1980, hold them for 7 months, and release them in March of 1981, only when the legal architecture for a much larger move was finally in place. That larger move required first eliminating the one threat inside of his own military that he could not co-opt. Sergeant Major Wilfred Hawker, the other Bikkel. The commando Fred Ormskerk had helped to train. The young man that finally understood what Bouterse actually was and was preparing to do something about it. 10 days into March 1981, 3 coups, 3 neutralizations, 1 seat at the top of the barracks, finally and fully claimed. That's what's coming next. Thanks for sticking around for another episode of the Suriname Contra Affair. This one was really interesting for me. There was things here that I learned that I've never had heard before. First of all, I think the role that Michel played kind of as an element of the institution, like protecting some of the Dutch interests and then staying there throughout the entire thing until the jungle commando. The other thing that I found interesting is just how many brave people there are in this entire story, and people who have been willing to come forward and speak their truth, even though they must have been very afraid to tell these stories. And there's just so many of those people that were there. Survivors, brave people, truth tellers. And I just want to let you know that I see that, and I know that that's difficult, and I think that you're the reason that these stories still exist, right? Those stories that you told to newspaper interviewers and to authors who came and discussed that with you, that took a lot of courage. And so kudos to you, and thank you to all of you all who did it, and also to all the intrepid reporters. I've talked to so many reporters and authors now, and people who were actually down there. People like Rudie and others who were sitting there when this was happening and who were facing guns and people kicking down their doors, all to tell a story, to tell the truth of what was happening. And again, these stories would not exist were it not for those people. So I think that what I am doing here is not necessarily so much in telling news stories, but gathering up the stories of other people who've taken the time to document these, and with modern technology and access to digital libraries and new information being released and new people coming forward to telling these stories, I can kind of compile them and serve them up from a different perspective. This is the Suriname Contra Affair. It's from the American perspective on Suriname that's incorporating both Surinamese and Dutch perspectives into the story. So I think that that's really my kind of contribution. I think there's going to be more original research in the second book and third book that maybe hasn't been told as much, but this is a lot of just compiling things. So either way, I feel honored to be able to do it. I feel appreciative to everybody who follows along with the story and contributes and helps me correct facts that I might have gotten right or adds new insights into this. Hope you all are enjoying it. If you made it this far, go ahead and hit the like and subscribe button. That really helps a lot to get notified when the new episodes drop, and also trying to spread the word out there. So thanks again. Hope you have a great week, and we'll talk to you soon.